Every Friday for 3 years, a man bought a ticket to nowhere and wept for a woman who would never come home. If you believe in kindness, in faith, in the strange and stubborn grace of second chances, I ask you to like this story, comment where it finds you, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe before we begin. What you're about to hear happened in a small Kansas town most maps forgot, and it will stay with you long after the last word. Larkspur Junction was not a place people came to. It was a place people passed through, a scattering of clapboard buildings clinging to the railroad tracks like burrs to a saddle blanket, with a feed store, a saloon that doubled as a post office, and a station house with a tin roof that rang like a bell when the rain came sideways off the plains. The wind never stopped in Larkspur Junction. It moved through the wheat fields in long silver waves, and it carried with it the smell of coal smoke from the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe line, and sometimes, if a man stood still long enough on the platform, it carried the sound of a woman laughing, though there was no woman there to laugh. Wilson Kincaid had built his ranch 3 miles east of town with his own 2 hands, plank by plank, fence post by fence post, in the years after the war when a man with strong arms and a quiet mouth could still stake a claim on the world and hope to keep it. He had married Evelyn Ashford in the spring of 1879, in a church with a leaking roof and a congregation of 40 people who loved them both, and for 4 years he had known a happiness so complete that he sometimes woke in the night just to make certain it was real, just to lay his hand against her back and feel her breathing. Evelyn had a sister in St. Louis who fell ill in the winter of 1882, and Evelyn went to nurse her, promising to return on the first warm Friday in spring. Wilson drove her to the station himself, held her face in his hands, and told her that he would be waiting on the platform when she came home, no matter how long it took, no matter what the weather did. She had laughed at him, that bright laugh that turned heads in church, and told him 3 weeks was not long enough to warrant such a promise. But he had made it anyway, because that was the kind of man he was, and because some part of him, some old instinct buried in his chest, already knew that promises were the only things a man could truly offer against the cruelty of the world. She never returned. The telegram came 11 days later, brought by a boy on a mule who did not know what he was carrying, only that Wilson Kincaid needed to read it standing up. Typhoid had taken Evelyn in St. Louis, quick and merciless, and there had been no time to send for him, no time for a final word, no time for anything but the terrible silence that followed. Wilson buried a coffin that had traveled home on the very train he promised to meet, and something in him broke that no doctor in Kansas could mend. For the first year, he did not go near the station at all. He worked his cattle from dawn until his body gave out from exhaustion rather than choice, because exhaustion was the only mercy he could find. But grief has a way of circling back on a man, and in the second year, Wilson found himself riding into town on a Friday afternoon for no reason he could name, and standing on the platform, and watching the eastbound train come around the bend with its whistle screaming across the prairie like something alive. He did not know why he did it. He only knew that somewhere in the smoke and the noise and the hiss of the brakes, he could almost hear her running, almost hear the particular rhythm of her boots on the boards, because Evelyn Kincaid had never once walked off a train in her life. She ran the last 20 yards every time, arms already reaching, because 3 hours of sitting still was 3 hours too long when the man you loved was waiting. So he kept coming. Every Friday, a few minutes before 4 o'clock, he tied his horse to the same post and bought a platform ticket from the ticket window, though he had nowhere to go and no train to board. He wore his good shirt, the blue one Evelyn had sewn the buttons onto herself. Some Fridays he brought wildflowers, black-eyed Susans or prairie clover, gathered from the ditch along the county road, though he never gave them to anyone, only held them in his lap like a man holding a small animal that might startle and run. He sat on the second bench from the east end of the platform, the bench closest to where the passenger cars always stopped, and he watched every single soul that stepped down onto Larkspur Junction, and when the last one had gone and the conductor called out and the great iron wheels began to turn again, Wilson watched the train shrink into the distance until it bent around the hill and vanished, and only then did he rise, and mount his horse, and ride home alone into a house that had been too quiet for 3 years. The town knew him, of course. Everyone in Larkspur Junction knew everyone else's sorrows the way they knew each other's cattle brands, but there was a code among frontier people, an unspoken understanding that grief was a man's own country, and no one had the right to cross its border uninvited. The station master, an old man named Horace Pruitt, sold Wilson his ticket every Friday without a word, and pocketed the coin, and let him be. The women at church spoke of him in low voices, calling him poor Mr. Kincaid, and pitied him from a respectful distance, the way you might pity a wolf that had lost its pack, admiring its endurance while keeping well clear of its teeth. Nobody asked him why. Not once, in 3 long years, had a single soul in Larkspur Junction sat down beside Wilson Kincaid and asked him what he was waiting for. Then, in the autumn of 1885, a young woman named Mara Ellison stepped off a stagecoach from Abilene with a single trunk and a letter of introduction to the station master, and everything in Larkspur Junction quietly, imperceptibly, began to change. Mara had buried her mother in November, and her father in February of that same terrible winter, both taken by the same lung sickness that had swept through her hometown like a grass fire, and she had come west because there was nothing left to keep her east, and because a distant cousin had written that the Santa Fe line was hiring clerks who could read and write and add a column of figures without error. She was 23 years old and carried herself like someone twice that age, with the careful, guarded posture of a woman who had learned that hope was a luxury the world did not always allow her to keep. She took the position at the ticket window, learned the timetables by heart within a week, and kept to herself in the small room she rented above the mercantile, believing, as she later confessed, that she had already lived the only life fate intended to give her, and that whatever remained was simply a matter of getting through the days. She noticed Wilson Kincaid the very first Friday she worked the window. He purchased his ticket with the same quiet courtesy he showed every week, counted out his coin, thanked her, and walked out to the platform to sit on the second bench from the east end. She watched him through the window as she balanced her ledger, and she watched him again the following Friday, and the one after that, this man in his good blue shirt who never boarded a train, who sometimes held wildflowers he never gave to anyone, who watched every passenger disembark with an expression she recognized because she had worn it herself, alone, in the mirror of her rented room. It was the expression of someone waiting for a person who was never coming back, and pretending, for one more week, that they might. She asked Horace Pruitt about him one slow afternoon, and the old man only shook his head and said that some sorrows were not his to tell, and that if she wanted to know Wilson Kincaid's story, she would have to earn it herself. Mara thought about that for a long while. She was not, by nature, a bold woman, but grief has a way of making a person recognize its shape in others, the way a traveler recognizes a fellow traveler on a lonesome road, and something in her would not let the matter rest. The rain came on the 3rd Friday in October, a cold, steady Kansas rain that turned the street to mud and hammered on the tin roof of the station like 1,000 small fists. The eastbound train was running behind schedule, delayed by washouts further down the line, and Wilson sat on his bench beneath the narrow overhang of the platform roof, soaked at the shoulders, wildflowers wilting in his lap, watching the empty tracks disappear into gray sheets of rain. Mara closed the ticket window early, telling herself it was because no more passengers would be coming through in such weather, though the truth, when she was honest with herself, was different. She stepped out onto the platform with her shawl drawn tight against the cold, walked the length of the boards past the freight office and the water tower, and sat down beside him on the second bench from the east end, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, only sat with him in the rain and the silence, because some part of her understood that this man did not need words yet. He needed company. It was Wilson who finally spoke, though not in answer to any question, simply because the silence beside him felt different than the silence he had grown used to. He said that the rain reminded him of a spring morning years back, and Mara, watching the tracks the way he watched them, asked the only question that had been sitting in her chest for 3 weeks. She asked him, quietly, without pressing, who he was waiting for. Wilson did not answer right away. He turned the stems of the wildflowers in his fingers, and the rain kept falling, and somewhere down the line a train whistle sounded, faint and far off, swallowed almost immediately by the storm. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, and used to the shape of these particular words, because he had never said them aloud to another living soul. He told her about Evelyn. He told her about the church with the leaking roof, and the ranch he'd built with his own hands, and the 4 years that had felt like one long unbroken morning of sunlight. He told her that his wife had never once walked off a train in her life, that no matter how long the journey, the moment the wheels stopped turning, she was up and moving before the other passengers had even risen from their seats, and that she ran the last 20 yards of every homecoming because 3 hours sitting still was an insult to a heart that missed him. He told her about the telegram carried by a boy on a mule who did not understand what he carried. He told her about the coffin that came home on the very train he had promised to meet her at, and how he had stood on this same platform, on this same bench, and understood for the first time in his life what it meant for the world to simply continue, indifferent, while everything inside a man went still. And then he told her the truth beneath the truth, the thing he had never spoken even to himself in plain words. He said that he did not truly believe Evelyn would step off that train. He was not a foolish man, and 3 years of empty platforms had cured him of any illusions on that account. But some part of him, some stubborn, wounded, faithful part, could not stop keeping the promise he had made her, because if he stopped, if he simply stayed home on a Friday afternoon and let the trains come and go unwatched, it would mean the promise was truly broken, and broken in a way that even death had not managed to break it. Coming to the station was not madness, he said. It was the last door he had left open to her, and a man did not close the last door to the person he loved, not while there was breath in him to keep it standing ajar. Mara Ellison sat very still beside him in the rain, and felt something crack open in her own chest, some doors she had bolted shut the winter she buried both her parents, and told herself that love only ever ended in loss, that it was safer, wiser, kinder to herself, never to open that door again. She understood, in that moment, on that rain-soaked platform, that she had been doing her own version of what Wilson did, only her door had no bench beside it, no wildflowers, no ritual of hope. She had simply closed hers and called it strength. She told him, then, about her mother and her father, about the terrible winter, about the long stagecoach ride west with a single trunk and no expectation of anything beyond survival. She told him that she had believed, truly believed, that she had already lived the whole of whatever life intended to give her, and that she had been managing the remainder ever since, the way a person manages a debt they know they'll never fully pay. Wilson listened to her the way she had listened to him, without interrupting, without offering the easy comforts that people so often reach for simply to fill a silence they cannot bear. And when the eastbound train finally came, hours late, its headlamp cutting weakly through the gray curtain of rain, they watched it together, and no one stepped off whither of them was waiting for, and somehow, for the first time in 3 years, Wilson Kincaid did not feel entirely alone when the last car pulled away and the tracks bent empty around the hill. That Friday changed the shape of every Friday after, though not, as Wilson would later say, because his grief ended. Grief did not work that way, and he would have distrusted anyone who told him it should. Evelyn was still gone, and the platform bench was still the place he came to keep faith with a promise death itself had not released him from. But now Mara Ellison walked out from the ticket window when her shift allowed it, and sat beside him, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, and the waiting became a thing shared instead of a thing endured alone. Through that autumn and into the hard Kansas winter, they sat together on Fridays as the trains came and went, and slowly, carefully, the way frost thaws from a window pane in patches rather than all at once, something began to grow between two people who had each believed their capacity, for it was buried in the ground with someone they loved. It was not romance that came first, though romance would come, quietly and honestly, in its own good time, the following spring, when Wilson finally brought a bundle of wildflowers to the station and did not hold them uselessly in his lap but placed them instead in Mara's hands. What came first was simpler and, in its way, more sacred. It was companionship. It was the recognition, hard won on both sides, that a burden shared does not disappear, but it does grow lighter, and that sitting beside another person's sorrow, without trying to fix it or hurry it along, is one of the truest kindnesses a human being can offer another. Mara never once told Wilson to stop waiting for Evelyn, and Wilson never once asked Mara to forget her parents. And in that mutual respect for what the other still carried, they found room enough to carry something new together as well. By the following autumn, Wilson Kincaid still rode into Larkspur Junction every Friday and still bought a platform ticket he never used. But now Mara closed the window at 4 o'clock and sat beside him as a matter of course, no longer a question but a certainty, the way the trains themselves were a certainty, and the wind through the wheat fields, and the long, slow turning of the Kansas seasons. He had not stopped loving Evelyn. He would tell anyone who asked, plainly and without shame, that he loved her still, and that he always would, and that the door he kept open for her on that platform bench remained open even after he opened another door beside it. Mara understood this better than anyone alive, because she had learned from him, in the rain, on that October Friday, that love does not divide itself into smaller and smaller pieces the more people we give it to. It multiplies. It makes room. The human heart, it turns out, is not a ledger with a fixed sum, but something closer to the prairie itself, capable of holding more than a person ever thought it could, if only someone is willing to sit down beside the empty places and stay. Before we come to the end, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching this story from, and tell me what lesson it left with you, because stories like this one belong to everyone who carries them forward, and I would love to know how it found you today. Wilson and Mara were married in the spring of 1887, in that same small church with the roof that had finally been mended, and Horace Pruitt gave the bride away because he said someone ought to, and the whole of Larkspur Junction turned out to see it, because everyone, it seemed, had been quietly hoping for this without daring to say so aloud. Wilson still visits the platform on Fridays sometimes, though not every week now, and when he does, Mara comes with him, and sometimes their children come too, and they sit together on the second bench from the East End and watch the trains the way other families might visit a grave, with tenderness rather than grief, honoring what was without being ruled by it. The wildflowers still get picked from the ditch along the county road. They still get carried in someone's lap. But now, more often than not, they get given away. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that grief need not be carried alone, that kindness has the power to sit down beside sorrow and change its shape without erasing it, I ask you to like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and second chances from the American frontier. Because somewhere out there, someone is still sitting on their own empty platform, waiting, and they deserve to know that they do not have to wait alone.